Sarah adjusted the strap of her duffel bag as she stepped through the wide doors of the base mess hall. The clatter of trays, the hum of voices, and the occasional burst of laughter all hit her at once, echoing off the high walls like the roar of a crowded stadium. It was her first week on base, her first time walking into a room full of soldiers who already knew the rhythms, the rituals, the unspoken hierarchy. She felt like an intruder, stepping into a world that hadn't quite decided whether to accept her or spit her out. Her boots clicked against the polished floor sharp, precise, almost too loud in her ears. Every step felt rehearsed, though inside she was anything but calm. She reminded herself of the drills, of the countless times she had been told to keep her back straight, her chin level, her stride even. Confidence is half the battle, one of her instructors had drilled into her. So she walked with her head high, even though her stomach twisted with nerves. The air smelled of grease and spices, of coffee burned too long in a pot, of bread freshly baked in the kitchen. Soldiers in different stages of eating filled the tables. Some bent low over trays. Some leaned back laughing with easy familiarity. They belonged here. Sarah, in contrast, felt the sharp edge of being new, of being watched. She caught quick glances, some curious, some dismissive, some openly skeptical. And then came the stares. At first, she thought she imagined them. But soon she noticed the way eyes didn't just meet hers. They lingered, sliding down her arm to where her uniform sleeve didn't quite cover the ink etched across her forearm. The tattoo was bold, black lines forming wings that arched toward her wrist, framing a pair of dog tags. Only a portion showed, but it was enough. Enough to draw whispers. Enough to draw laughter. It started quietly, like the flicker of a flame. A chuckle from one corner, a smirk shared between two men at the far table. Sarah heard the low hiss of words carried just far enough to sting. "Look at that," one soldier muttered, nudging his buddy. "Fresh out of training and already thinks she's some kind of badass," the other snickered, his eyes darting toward Sarah's arm. Her throat tightened, but she kept walking. She forced her boots to stay steady, her gaze fixed on the tray line ahead. If she faltered now, they'd see it. They'd know she heard them, know they'd gotten under her skin. And she couldn't give them that. Still, her ears burned. As she reached for a tray, more voices floated toward her. "Probably got it after a party," someone said, the words dripping with sarcasm. "Bet it doesn't mean a damn thing." Laughter followed, louder this time. A ripple spread through the tables like a wave, each chuckle feeding the next. Sarah clenched her jaw so tight it hurt. She reminded herself why she was here, why she had chosen this path. She wasn't the first woman to walk into a room full of skeptics, and she wouldn't be the last. She had earned her place through grueling hours of training, through bruises and blisters, through sleepless nights of drills and study. She had earned the right to wear the uniform. She wasn't about to let whispers and smirks take that away. But that didn't make it easier. As she slid her tray down the line, the clatter of plates and utensils couldn't drown out the laughter echoing from behind her. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a cup of water, but she steadied them quickly. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her shaken. She breathed deeply, summoning the discipline she had fought to build. Her instructors had warned her. Respect wasn't given, it was earned. Some soldiers still carried old biases, quick to judge, quicker to laugh. But Sarah also knew something they didn't. The tattoo on her arm wasn't rebellion. It wasn't recklessness. It wasn't a careless mark of youth. It was her brother. She remembered the day she got it, the sting of the needle, the smell of antiseptic, the weight of her grief pressing against her chest. Every line of the wings had been carefully chosen, every curve of the dog tags placed with purpose. It wasn't decoration. It was memory. Her brother's laughter, his strength, his sacrifice, all captured in ink. When she looked at it, she didn't see rebellion. She saw the reason she kept moving forward, the reason she refused to quit. But they didn't know that. And right now, all they saw was something to mock. She carried her tray carefully, searching for a place to sit. Most tables were full, clusters of soldiers eating and talking in groups. No one waved her over. No one made room. Finally, she found an empty spot near the back, sliding onto the bench with quiet determination. She set her tray down, picked up her fork, and focused on the food, though she could barely taste it. The noise around her rose in fell laughter, stories, the clash of silverware. Every so often, she felt eyes on her again, sharp as needles. She forced herself not to look up, not to acknowledge them. She ate in silence, slow and steady, every bite a small act of defiance. Still, the weight of isolation pressed on her. This wasn't the brotherhood she had dreamed of, the unity she had imagined when she first swore the oath. This was something harsher, something that demanded she prove herself again and again, not just through skill or strength, but through resilience in the face of mockery. And yet somewhere deep inside Sarah welcomed the challenge. Because if she could survive this, if she could hold her head high now, then nothing they threw at her later would break her. She didn't need their approval tonight. She only needed to endure. She finished her meal in silence, pushed her tray forward, and folded her hands on the table. Around her, the laughter carried on. The whispers didn't stop. But Sarah sat tall, her eyes forward, her tattoo resting silently on her arm like a shield. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that before the night ended, the laughter would stop. And when it did, it would be because of someone none of them expected. The laughter didn't fade with time, it grew. What had begun as a few chuckles around one table spread across the mess hall like smoke after a spark. The sound rose and fell, sometimes muffled by clinking utensils, sometimes sharp enough to cut through the room like a blade. Sarah sat at her table, her hands resting still, her fork pushed aside. She could hear it all, the words, the whispers, the careless cruelty of soldiers who thought mocking was just another way to pass the time. At first, it was subtle. A soldier leaned toward his buddy, tilting his head in Sarah's direction. "Fresh ink," he said with a smirk. "Bet it's something dumb. A butterfly or her boyfriend's initials." His friend snorted into his drink, coughing as laughter spilled across the table. Sarah heard every syllable, though they spoke as if she weren't sitting just a few feet away. Another voice cut in, louder this time. No, it's gotta be worse. Maybe she lost a bet. The table erupted in laughter again. One soldier slapped the table hard enough to make his drink spill, drawing more attention from nearby groups. Heads turned. Smiles spread. Soon the jokes weren't confined to one corner. They floated across the room, bouncing from table to table, each soldier adding fuel to the fire. Sarah's stomach twisted. She had faced tougher things before: grueling training, punishing drills, the kind of exhaustion that left her body trembling. But this was different. Training tested your strength. This tested your spirit. And as the laughter echoed, she realized something painfully clear. Respect wasn't automatic here. She would have to earn it in ways she hadn't anticipated. A fork clattered against a plate somewhere behind her, followed by a mocking voice. "Hey, maybe it says Mom on it." Real tough, more laughter. Or maybe it's her cat's name. Another soldier shouted across the room, his words bold enough to make several heads turn toward Sarah. The laughter swelled again, a cruel tide she couldn't stop. Sarah's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She wanted to stand up, to shout that they were wrong, that they didn't know a damn thing about her, or the ink etched into her arm. She wanted to tell them about her brother, about his sacrifice, about the reason she carried his memory on her skin. But she stayed silent. Not because she was ashamed, but because she refused to give them her pain as entertainment. Instead, she drew in a long, steady breath and lifted her chin higher. She focused on the wall ahead of her, on the flag that hung proudly at the far end of the mess hall. Its colors were bold and unwavering, untouched by laughter, untouched by cruelty. Sarah anchored herself to that flag, reminding herself why she was here. Not for their approval, not for their jokes. She was here to serve, to honor, to protect. Still, the whispers kept cutting at her. Doesn't she know tattoos are unprofessional? One soldier muttered, not bothering to keep his voice low. Looks like she's trying too hard. His buddy grinned. She'll wash out in a month. They laughed again, confident in their judgment, blind to their ignorance. Every word pressed against Sarah like a weight. She felt the urge to fold into herself, to make her tattoo disappear beneath her sleeve, to retreat until the laughter lost interest. But another part of her, the part that had carried her through nights of grief and mornings of resolve, told her to stay, to endure, to stand tall even when the ground seemed to tremble beneath her. She forced her body to remain still, her expression unreadable. She ate a few more bites of food, slow and deliberate, as if the noise around her didn't exist. But inside, her chest burned. Every laugh wasn't just about her. It was about the memory she carried. About her brother, whose sacrifice was now the subject of mockery, though none of them knew it. It wasn't fair. It wasn't just. And it wasn't something she could ignore forever. As the noise grew, she noticed the way some soldiers stayed silent. Not everyone laughed. A few glanced her way, uncomfortable, their eyes saying what their voices didn't. I don't agree, but I won't stop it either. Their silence was almost as sharp as the laughter. Sarah realized then that in rooms like this, mockery wasn't just about the words spoken. It was about the choice to stay silent, to let cruelty spread unchecked. And that silence cut deepest of all. Still, she refused to break. She straightened her back, her shoulders squared, her expression calm. Every laugh that rang out became another test of her resolve. She had endured worse. She would endure this. Then came the boldest voice yet. A soldier at the far side of the room leaned back in his chair, his boots propped carelessly on the bench. You know what I think? He called, loud enough for half the hall to hear. I think she's just showing off. Probably thinks that ink makes her tough. Newsflash, it doesn't. His words drew another wave of laughter, louder and sharper than before. Sarah's jaw tightened. She forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to scream at him, to wipe the smug grin off his face with the truth. But she didn't. Instead, she met his eyes for the briefest moment. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, sharp enough to silence him for just a heartbeat. His grin faltered, only slightly, before the laughter of his buddies carried him back into arrogance. But Sarah saw it. She had gotten through to him, if only for a moment. And that was enough to remind her of something vital. Strength wasn't always loud. Sometimes strength was in silence, in the refusal to bow, in the quiet endurance that outlasted every taunt. She lowered her gaze back to her tray, her shoulders still squared, her head still high. The laughter didn't stop, but she no longer felt crushed by it. Instead, she felt something building inside her, a quiet fire, a steady flame that no amount of mockery could extinguish. What Sarah didn't know was that she wasn't alone in noticing. A pair of eyes had been watching from the moment she entered. Eyes sharp, calculating, seasoned by years of command. The colonel had seen it all, the laughter, the whispers, the strength in Sarah's silence. And though he hadn't yet spoken, he was about to. The soldiers thought they were just passing time, just having fun at someone else's expense. But soon, Their laughter would collapse under the weight of a truth far greater than any of them had imagined. The laughter echoed in the mess hall, but Sarah's mind drifted far away from the room, back to a night years earlier when the world had cracked open beneath her feet. She remembered the phone call, the one that split her life into before and after. It was just past midnight when the knock came on her mother's door. Sarah had been home from school for the summer, sprawled across the couch with a book, when the sound jolted her upright. Her mother answered, and two uniformed men stood on the porch, their faces grim, their eyes heavy with a sorrow that spoke before their mouths did. "Ma'am," one of them said gently, his voice steady but thick, "we regret to inform you." The words blurred after that. Sarah's ears rang, her chest tightened, her body frozen in disbelief. Her brother Daniel, her protector, her role model, her best friend, was gone. Killed in action. A roadside bomb. Quick, merciless. The kind of death that left no warning, no chance for goodbye. Her mother crumbled. Sarah remembered holding her, her own tears falling unchecked, the room spinning around her. She wanted to scream, to break something, to wake up from what felt like a nightmare. But the nightmare didn't end. Days passed in a haze. The funeral came, flags folded with precision, rifles firing in salute, the solemn notes of taps carrying into the sky. Sarah sat in the front row, her hands trembling in her lap as the casket lowered into the earth. She remembered staring at the polished wood, unable to reconcile the truth. Her brother was inside, silent forever. Daniel had been more than a brother. He had been her compass, her anchor. When their father walked out years ago, Daniel had stepped up, becoming the steady presence in their lives. He taught her how to ride a bike, how to throw a punch, how to stand tall when the world tried to knock you down. He had been her shield against bullies, her voice of encouragement during exams, her late-night confidant when life felt overwhelming. And now he was gone. In the weeks that followed, Sarah felt hollow. Every room in their house carried echoes of him. The worn boots by the door, the jacket hanging in the closet, the photos lining the walls. His absence was everywhere, heavy and suffocating. She wandered through those days like a ghost, unsure of who she was without him. Then came the moment that changed everything. She had been walking past a tattoo shop downtown, her eyes swollen from another night of tears, when she stopped dead in her tracks. In the window was a design, a set of wings, bold and powerful, framing a set of dog tags. Something about it froze her in place. The image seemed to reach out to her, whispering that memory didn't have to fade into silence. It could live on, carried with her, a mark no one could take away. That night, Sarah walked into the shop. The smell of ink and antiseptic filled her nose as she sat in the chair, her heart pounding. The artist asked her if she was sure. She nodded, though tears welled in her eyes. As the needle touched her skin, pain flared, sharp and relentless. But she welcomed it. Every sting felt like a thread, stitching her brother's memory into her flesh. The wings spread across her arm, each line deliberate, each curve purposeful. At their center, the dog tags bore Daniel's initials and service number, inked with precision. And beneath them, in small, steady script, the date of his death. When it was finished, Sarah stared at her reflection. The tattoo was raw, red, her skin tender, but it was beautiful. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't a whim. It was Daniel. It was the story of his sacrifice etched into her skin, a story she vowed to carry for the rest of her life. From that day on, the tattoo became more than ink. It became a vow to honor her brother's memory, to live with the strength he had taught her, to serve in the way he had served. It was the reason she joined the military, not to escape her grief, but to transform it, to ensure his sacrifice wasn't just remembered in silence, but carried forward in action. Every time she looked at the tattoo, she felt him with her. When training grew unbearable, when her muscles screamed and her lungs burned, she looked at the ink and pushed harder. When doubts crept in, when instructors barked orders until her mind felt like it would collapse, she traced the lines on her arm and found her resolve again. Daniel had believed in her. He had always said she was stronger than she knew. The tattoo reminded her of that, day after day. And now, sitting in the mess hall, surrounded by laughter and mockery, Sarah knew they didn't see any of this. They didn't see Daniel's face, his sacrifice, his love. They only saw ink. They only saw what they wanted to see, a weakness, a joke, a reason to dismiss her. She wanted to scream the truth at them, to stand on the table and shout, "This tattoo is my brother. This tattoo is the reason I'm here. This tattoo is blood, memory, sacrifice. And you dare to laugh at it?" But she stayed silent. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood something they didn't. The story wasn't theirs to take from her. The meaning wasn't theirs to twist with laughter. The tattoo belonged to her and to Daniel, and no amount of mockery could strip it of its power. She ran her fingers along the edge of her sleeve, feeling the raised ridges of the ink beneath the fabric. It grounded her, steadied her, reminded her who she was. Let them laugh, she thought. Let them mock what they don't understand. Because one day, the truth would come out. One day, they would see that her tattoo wasn't weakness. It was strength. One day, they would realize that the marks they mocked were the same marks many of them carried, hidden beneath their sleeves, etched into their hearts. And when that day came, their laughter would turn to silence. Sarah sat taller, her eyes steady, her expression calm. The noise around her was sharp, cruel, unrelenting. But inside, she held on to the story behind the ink, the story of Daniel, the story of love, the story of sacrifice. They could laugh at the tattoo all they wanted, but they would never laugh away the truth. The mess hall was alive with noise, the kind of unrestrained laughter that fed on itself, growing louder with every cruel remark. Trays clattered, spoons scraped, and voices ricocheted off the high ceiling until the room felt like a carnival of mockery. Sarah sat still, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the far wall, but inside her pulse hammered. Every chuckle cut like a blade, every whisper weighed on her chest. And then, without warning, the doors opened. The heavy metal hinges groaned, and a rush of cool air swept into the hall. Conversation faltered. Heads turned instinctively, as though pulled by a force stronger than habit. And there he was, Colonel Mitchell. He walked into the mess hall with the calm authority of a man who had, long ago, stopped needing to raise his voice to command attention. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his ribbons and medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His boots struck the floor in steady rhythm, each step echoing louder than the laughter had only moments before. Sarah had never spoken to him directly, but she knew who he was. Everyone did. A career soldier with decades of service. He was a man whose name carried weight, whose reputation traveled ahead of him like a shadow. Stories about him were whispered in training barracks, of battles survived, of comrades lost, of leadership that inspired loyalty as much as it demanded discipline. He was a man forged by war, hardened by loss, respected by all. And now he was here. The room shifted instantly. Soldiers straightened in their seats, shoulders stiffening, spines snapping upright. Conversations cut short mid-sentence, utensils froze halfway to mouths. The air thickened with unease, as though everyone collectively remembered they were supposed to be soldiers, not children gossiping in a schoolyard. But the colonel didn't bark an order. He didn't scold or demand silence. He simply walked slow, deliberate, his gaze sweeping the room. Sarah felt his eyes pass over her, sharp and discerning, but they didn't linger. Not yet. Instead, They moved across the tables, pausing at the faces of the soldiers who had been laughing the loudest. The effect was immediate. Men who had been slouched in their chairs now sat rigid. Smirks evaporated, replaced by thin, nervous lines of lips pressed shut. The colonel's presence was like a storm rolling in silent, heavy, impossible to ignore. He reached the center of the hall and stopped. For a moment, he simply stood there, hands clasped loosely behind his back, his expression unreadable. The silence grew deeper, punctuated only by the faint clink of a cup being set down somewhere in the distance. Sarah felt the weight of that silence press against her chest. She wanted to shrink under it, but she forced herself to remain still. She kept her head high, her posture unbroken. If the colonel noticed her tattoo, if he saw the way the room had turned against her, she wouldn't meet his gaze with shame. She would meet it with the same steadiness she had fought to hold all night. Finally, he moved. His boots struck the floor as he walked toward one of the noisiest tables, the very group that had hurled the cruelest remarks. The soldiers at that table froze, eyes wide, hands fidgeting nervously with forks and napkins. The colonel stopped at their side. He didn't speak. He didn't even frown. He simply stood, his silence heavier than any reprimand could have been. The soldiers squirmed under his gaze, their bravado dissolving like paper in water. One of them cleared his throat, another shifted in his seat, but no one dared to meet his eyes. The entire hall watched. Sarah's pulse quickened. She could feel the tension building, an invisible current running through the room. The colonel was not a man to waste movements, and every second of his silence carried meaning. When he finally turned his head, his eyes swept the hall again, pausing briefly on Sarah, longer this time, before continuing. It wasn't a look of pity. It wasn't even a look of sympathy. It was sharper, steadier, as though he was measuring her, weighing her resilience against the laughter that had filled the air minutes before. Sarah held his gaze for a breath, refusing to flinch. Something flickered in his eyes, not surprise, not disapproval, but recognition. And then he looked away. The colonel took a step back, his hands moving to the buttons of his jacket. The room stilled further, if that were even possible. Soldiers leaned forward slightly, watching with wide eyes. No one dared to whisper now. Sarah felt her breath catch. She didn't know what was coming, but the weight of the moment pressed against her ribs like a held note in a song. The colonel unbuttoned his jacket with deliberate care. His movements were unhurried, almost ceremonial. He slid the fabric off his shoulders, folding it neatly across one arm. And then he turned, his forearm visible to the entire hall. Gasps rippled through the room. There, inked into his skin, was a tattoo. Not bright and fresh like Sarah's, but faded with age, the lines softened by time. It stretched across his forearm in bold black letters names. Dozens of them, etched row by row. Soldiers he had served with. Comrades he had buried. Brothers and sisters who had never come home. The hall was silent. The colonel didn't speak. He didn't need to. His tattoo told a story more powerful than any lecture could. It was a story of loss, of sacrifice, of loyalty carved permanently into flesh. Every soldier in the room knew instantly what it meant. Every name was a life, a bond, a memory carried forward in ink. Sarah stared, her chest tightening. She understood immediately. This was no act of rebellion. This was remembrance. This was honor. This was exactly what her own tattoo meant, though her story had not yet been told. The colonel raised his arm slightly, just enough for the light to catch the faded ink. His eyes swept the hall again, pinning every soldier in place. The laughter was gone. In its place was silence, so heavy it rang louder than the noise had. Silence filled with realization, with shame, with respect. Soldiers who had mocked moments before now lowered their heads, their eyes glued to their trays. Others stared at the colonel, wide-eyed, as if seeing him anew. Sarah felt the tension in her chest ease, not because the mockery had been erased, but because the truth had begun to rise. She wasn't alone in carrying her story. The colonel had carried his for decades, right there on his skin. And now, the entire room had seen it. What he said next would change everything. The silence that followed the colonel's reveal was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. It wasn't the kind of silence that came when a room emptied, or when voices naturally faded. No, this silence had weight. It pressed against the walls, against the air, against every soldier sitting frozen at their tables. The tattoo on the colonel's arm seemed to burn itself into the collective memory of the room. Names, dozens of them, etched in black ink that had faded over time, but never lost its meaning. Each one was a reminder of sacrifice, of lives given for the flag that hung at the far end of the mess hall. It was impossible to look at those names and laugh. It was impossible to look and not feel the gravity of what they represented. But the colonel still hadn't said a word. He stood there, jacket folded over his arm, his forearm exposed, his gaze sweeping the room like a searchlight. His eyes were sharp, but not wild, controlled, disciplined. Soldiers shifted under that gaze, some dropping their eyes to their trays, others sitting rigidly, still as though afraid to move. Sarah sat straighter, her breath shallow but steady. She had expected anger, maybe even a reprimand shouted across the hall. But what she saw instead was something far more powerful. Restraint. The colonel didn't need to raise his voice. His silence said more than words ever could. He turned his head slowly, his gaze settling on the group of soldiers who had been laughing the loudest earlier. The men stiffened immediately. One cleared his throat nervously. Another adjusted his collar, as though suddenly too hot in his own skin. The colonel's stare lingered, unblinking, heavy enough to crush any false bravado they still carried. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20, 30. The laughter that had once seemed endless now felt like a distant memory. No one dared to break the quiet. Even the clatter of utensils had stopped, as though every soldier feared the sound of their fork, scraping a plate, might draw the colonel's eyes in their direction. Sarah glanced around the room. The transformation was almost surreal. Moments ago, it had been a theater of mockery. Now it was a courtroom. The colonel the unyielding judge, his tattoo the undeniable evidence of truths too heavy for jokes. And still, he said nothing. The silence became its own form of punishment. Those who had mocked Sarah shifted in their seats, their faces flushed with shame. One young soldier at the edge of the group bit his lip hard, his eyes darting anywhere but at the colonel. Another clasped his hands tightly together on the table, his knuckles white. They had thought themselves clever, untouchable behind their laughter. Now they looked like children caught with their hands in the fire. Sarah's chest tightened as she realized something important. This silence wasn't just for them. It was for everyone, for those who had laughed, for those who had stayed silent, for every soldier who had forgotten that behind every tattoo, every scar, every mark, there was a story that deserved respect. The colonel's gaze moved again, slower this time. It swept the room, row by row, table by table. When his eyes finally landed on Sarah, the weight of it nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. He didn't glare at her. He didn't frown. His eyes held no anger, no pity. Instead, there was something else. Recognition. Understanding. It lasted only a few seconds, but to Sarah, it felt longer. In his gaze, she felt seen not just the uniform she wore, not just the ink on her arm, but the story behind it, the burden she carried. It was as if the colonel understood without her saying a word. And then his eyes moved on. He looked back at the soldiers who had mocked her, his expression unreadable, but his silence deafening. The message was clear. He had seen them. He had measured them. And he found them wanting. No lecture could have struck deeper. No shouted reprimand could have cut sharper. His silence forced them to face themselves, to replay their laughter in their minds and feel the weight of their disrespect against the reality of the names inked into his arm. Sarah noticed the way shoulders slumped, the way eyes fell to the floor, the way the once loud table now sat in shameful quiet. The colonel hadn't humiliated them. He had let them humiliate themselves. Minutes passed like hours. The hall remained frozen, the colonel at its center, the air thick with unspoken lessons. Finally, he shifted, turning slightly as though preparing to speak. Every soldier in the room straightened instinctively, breaths caught in anticipation. But he didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, he adjusted the jacket folded over his arm and walked slowly around the table of mockers. Each step was measured, unhurried, heavy with intent. His boots struck the floor with the rhythm of judgment, each step echoing louder in the silence. The men at the table sat rigid, their eyes glued to their trays. One swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. Another clenched his jaw, his bravado cracked and broken. The colonel said nothing, but his silence screamed louder than 100 shouted words. When he finished his slow circle, he returned to the center of the room. He stood tall, his forearm still visible, the ink still catching the harsh fluorescent light. His eyes swept the room one last time. The silence was absolute now. It wasn't just quiet, it was reverent. Every soldier felt it. They weren't just in the presence of their commanding officer. They were in the presence of a truth, larger than rank, larger than the room itself. Sarah's chest swelled with something she hadn't felt all night. Relief. For the first time since she had entered the mess hall, she no longer felt alone. The colonel's silence had bridged the gap between her and the others. He had reminded them all of what mattered: service, sacrifice, respect. And though he hadn't spoken a word yet, Sarah knew he would. She knew the moment was coming when his silence would break, and when it did, his words would carve themselves into every soldier's memory. The colonel stood, steady and unyielding, the weight of his presence pressing against every corner of the room. He had given them time to think, time to feel the shame of their actions, time to realize the gravity of what they had mocked. And now, as he drew a slow breath, Sarah knew the silence was about to end. And when it did, the lesson would be one they would never forget. The mess hall sat frozen in that unbearable silence, the air thick with tension and shame. Every soldier present knew that the moment had not yet reached its peak, that the colonel's silence was building toward something. His presence alone had already shifted the atmosphere, but what came next would decide whether the lesson took root or was forgotten with time. Sarah's eyes never left him. She had spent the evening surrounded by laughter that cut into her like knives, and now she sat on the edge of her seat, her pulse thundering. Whatever the colonel was about to do, she knew it mattered. She could feel it in her bones. The colonel stood in the center of the room, his forearm already exposed with the faded names tattooed into his skin. The silence had done its work. The laughter was dead. Shame had replaced mockery, and respect, raw, reluctant, but growing, had crept into the eyes of those who had cheered. And then he moved. With slow, deliberate precision, he placed his folded jacket on the edge of a nearby table. The sound was soft, almost inaudible, but in the absolute quiet of the room, it rang like a gavel striking wood. Every head turned slightly, every breath caught. The colonel straightened, his chest broad, his uniform shirt stretched taut across his frame. He began unbuttoning it, one button at a time, his movements unhurried, deliberate, ritualistic. Soldiers stared in wide-eyed silence, uncertain of what they were about to witness. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She had already seen his forearm, the names of the fallen inked into his flesh. That alone had shaken the room to its core. What more could there be? The last button came undone. He slid the shirt from his shoulders, folding it neatly just as he had with his jacket. Now he stood in a plain olive undershirt, the sleeves rolled high enough to reveal the full extent of the tattoos that adorned his arms. Gasps whispered through the hall. Both arms were covered, not in random designs or rebellious scribbles, but in carefully placed, deliberate markings, names, dates, coordinates, symbols of units long gone, etched into his flesh as permanent memorials. His skin was a battlefield of memory, every line of ink a scar that never faded. The colonel raised his right arm slowly, turning it so the light caught a series of names running from his bicep down to his wrist. "These," he said finally, his voice gravelly but strong, breaking the silence like a crack of thunder, "are the names of men and women I served with, brothers and sisters who didn't come home." His words were calm, but the weight behind them was undeniable. He turned his left arm, revealing another string of names. "And these are from my second deployment. Friends, leaders, soldiers who gave everything. I carry them here because I refuse to forget. Because every day I wake up, I owe them this much to remember." The room was still. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Sarah's chest tightened, her eyes stinging as she listened. She understood exactly what he was saying. Every mark on his skin was a story, just as hers was. He wasn't showing them rebellion, he was showing them devotion. The colonel let his arms fall back to his sides, his gaze sweeping the hall. "You think tattoos are for jokes?" His voice was sharp now, cutting across the silence like a blade. "You think they're about looking tough? About drawing attention?" No one answered. He took a step closer to the table of mockers, his eyes burning into them. "Every line on my arms represents a life, a sacrifice, a debt I can never repay. They are not decorations. They are not for your amusement. They are the weight I carry every day, so that those names are never forgotten." The young men at the table lowered their heads, shame etched into their faces. Their arrogance had dissolved completely, crushed beneath the colonel's words. Sarah sat frozen, her heart pounding. She felt the words strike her deeply, not as a reprimand, but as a truth she had lived herself. Her tattoo wasn't a decoration. It wasn't rebellion. It was memory, carved into her skin so the world would know. The colonel's eyes shifted then, locking onto her. He took a slow step in her direction. The hall seemed to hold its breath. When he reached her table, he stopped. He didn't tower over her with intimidation. He simply stood, steady and grounded, his gaze fixed on her arm where the faint outline of her tattoo peeked from beneath her sleeve. "Stand," he said softly. Sarah's breath caught. She rose slowly, her legs trembling but her spine straight. She met his gaze, refusing to let fear break her. The colonel extended a hand toward her sleeve. "Show them." Her throat tightened. For a moment she hesitated, her mind flashing back to the laughter, the mockery, the cruel jeers. But then she remembered his forearm, the names, the scars, the stories he carried without apology. With steady hands, she pulled back her sleeve, revealing her tattoo fully to the room. It wasn't elaborate. A single line of ink ran across her forearm, curving into the shape of a feather. Inside the feather, etched in delicate script, was a name. Just one name. Her brother's. The hall was silent still, but it was no longer the silence of mockery or shame. It was the silence of reverence, of respect. Every soldier in that room understood now. Her tattoo wasn't rebellion. It wasn't vanity. It was remembrance. The colonel nodded once, slowly, his eyes meeting hers with something that felt like kinship. Then he turned, addressing the hall once more. "This soldier carries her story on her skin," he said firmly, "just as I carry mine. And you," he swept his gaze across the room, sharp as a blade, "you will respect it." The words hit like a hammer. No one dared to move. No one dared to look away. The shame in the room had been replaced by something else understanding, raw and unshakable. The colonel stepped back, his undershirt clinging to his broad shoulders, his tattoos on full display. "Never forget," he said quietly, his voice softer now, but no less commanding, "that behind every mark, every scar, every story, there is a soldier who has sacrificed. And that deserves your respect, not your laughter." Sarah felt her chest swell with something she hadn't felt since the laughter began. Pride. Her tattoo, once a target of ridicule, had become a badge of honor under the colonel's words. The hall remained silent, every soldier locked in the weight of what had just unfolded. The colonel's jacket lay folded neatly on the table, forgotten, while the truth stood plainly inked on his arms. And in that silence, something shifted not just for Sarah, but for everyone in the room. They would never look at her tattoo the same way again. The weight of the colonel's words lingered in the air long after they were spoken. They seemed to echo against the walls, bounce off the tables, and settle heavily into the minds of every soldier in the hall. No one laughed. No one whispered. No one dared even to scrape a chair against the floor. The mess hall, once alive with noise and cruelty, had been transformed into a cathedral of silence, where ink and memory carried the weight of prayers. Sarah remained standing at the colonel's side, her tattoo exposed to the room. The feather etched into her forearm caught the light, the name inside it now visible to every eye. Just hours before, that mark had made her the target of ridicule. Now, under the colonel's presence, it had become a symbol. Her heart raced, but it was not with shame. For the first time since she had stepped into the hall, she felt no need to hide. Instead, she felt tall, her spine straight, her chin lifted. Pride hard won and long denied swelled in her chest. The colonel let the silence stretch a moment longer, as though he knew it needed time to root itself in their minds. Then finally he lowered his arms and turned slightly toward Sarah. He gave her a small nod, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed to anyone else, but to her it felt monumental. It was acknowledgement. It was respect. Then he spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "A unit is only as strong as the respect it shows one another. When you laugh at a soldier's scars, their tattoos, their marks, you laugh at their history. You laugh at their sacrifice. And in doing so, you weaken us all." His gaze swept across the hall. The young men who had mocked Sarah earlier shrank under his eyes. Their shame was evident, flushed faces, stiff postures, eyes fixed downward. They no longer looked like confident soldiers. They looked like boys who had just been confronted with truths far bigger than themselves. But the colonel wasn't finished. "You are soldiers," he said, his voice rising slightly, filled with steel. "You wear this uniform not for yourselves, but for the person next to you, for the ones who came before you, and for the ones who will come after. You don't get to decide which stories are worth respect. Every story is. Every sacrifice is. And if you forget that, if you ever forget that you dishonor this uniform." The words cut deep. Heads bowed lower. Chests tightened. For many of them, it was the first time they had truly felt the weight of what it meant to serve, not in theory, not in slogans, but in the raw reality of lives lived and lost. Sarah watched the transformation unfold. The same soldiers who had mocked her just hours earlier now avoided her gaze entirely, their faces etched with regret. They shifted in their seats, restless, uncomfortable, under the burden of their own actions. It wasn't the colonel's tattoos alone that had silenced them. It was the undeniable truth behind them. And for Sarah, that truth was liberating. She glanced down at her own tattoo again. The feather looked different now, not because the ink had changed, but because the meaning had been recognized. The name inscribed within it no longer felt like a private grief mocked by strangers. It had been seen, acknowledged, and validated in the most public way possible. The colonel stepped back, allowing his words to settle. Then, with deliberate calm, he bent down, picked up his folded shirt and jacket, and began dressing once more. His movements were steady, ritualistic, almost ceremonial. He buttoned his shirt with precision, slid his arms into the jacket, and fastened it tight. By the time he finished, his tattoos were hidden once again, but their memory remained burned into the minds of everyone in the room. The hall remained silent as he turned toward the exit. He walked slowly, deliberately, his boots echoing against the tile floor. Each step felt like a drumbeat, marking the end of something old and the beginning of something new. When he reached the doors, he stopped. Without turning back, he spoke one final sentence. "Remember what you saw tonight." Then he left. The doors closed behind him with a soft thud, and for a long moment, the hall remained still. Soldiers sat frozen, unsure how to move forward from what they had just witnessed. Sarah lowered her sleeve slowly, her hands steady. She sat back down, but the air around her had changed. No one dared to look at her with disdain now. No one whispered. In fact, several soldiers glanced at her with something closer to respect. The group that had mocked her earlier looked the most shaken. One of them finally broke the silence, clearing his throat nervously. "Hey, He glanced in Sarah's direction, but quickly dropped his gaze again. "Sorry." His voice was barely audible, but it carried in the quiet. Another followed, muttering an apology under his breath. The others nodded awkwardly, unable to meet her eyes, but clearly regretting their behavior. Sarah didn't respond. She didn't need to. Their shame was enough. But more important than their apologies was the shift she felt inside herself. She had come into the hall expecting to endure ridicule, to swallow her pride and bear the laughter in silence. Instead, she had been vindicated not by her own words, but by the colonel's presence, his truth, his tattoos. He had turned her vulnerability into strength. The hall gradually began to stir again, but the noise was different now. Conversations were hushed, respectful. Laughter did not return. Instead, there was a heavy awareness that hung over every table, a collective understanding that things had changed. Sarah picked at her food, no longer caring about the whispers or the stares. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't a target. She was a soldier among soldiers. Her tattoo no longer a source of shame, but a mark of remembrance, honored by the highest authority in the room. She knew the story of that night would spread. Soldiers would talk. They always did. But this time, the story would not be one of mockery. It would be one of respect of the colonel, who stripped off his jacket, revealed his tattoos, and silenced an entire hall with the truth of sacrifice. And in that story, her tattoo would be remembered not as a punchline, but as a symbol. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't triumph, it was relief. Relief that she no longer carried her brother's memory alone, hidden beneath sleeves and silence. Relief that, for once, the weight had been shared. The night had begun with laughter at her expense, but it ended with a silence that spoke louder than any mockery ever could. That silence, Sarah realized, was the turning point. It was the moment everything changed. In the days that followed, the mess hall incident became the most talked about event on base. Soldiers who hadn't been there heard the story within hours, passed down in whispers and retellings that grew heavier with each repetition. By the end of the week, it had spread far beyond the unit. Everyone seemed to know the tale, the night the colonel removed his jacket and silenced an entire hall. For Sarah, the change was immediate. The same soldiers who had once laughed at her now nodded when they passed her in the corridor. Some offered quiet apologies, awkward but sincere. Others said nothing but held her gaze with the kind of respect that needed no words. The jeers were gone. The laughter had vanished. What remained was recognition of her tattoo, of her story, of the brother whose name she carried on her skin. She felt lighter, though the ink on her arm weighed the same. It wasn't that the grief had disappeared. It never would, but the burden of carrying it alone had been lifted. The colonel had shared it, if only for a night, and in doing so, had given her strength she hadn't known she possessed. What surprised Sarah most, however, was how the moment changed the others. The unit seemed different, as though the colonel's silence and words had carved something deeper into them than orders ever could. The laughter that once filled the mess hall turned into quieter, more thoughtful conversations. Soldiers who had mocked now listened more. They asked questions instead of making jokes. They treated each other's scars, visible and invisible, with greater care. It wasn't perfect. Soldiers were still soldiers, rough around the edges, prone to teasing and rivalry. But something fundamental had shifted. The cruel edge of mockery had dulled, replaced by a cautious respect. Sarah noticed it most during late-night watches, when conversations tended to drift into more personal territory. Where once tattoos might have been ridiculed, now they were asked about. A scar on a hand led to a story about a training accident. A small mark on a shoulder sparked a tale of a deployment gone wrong. And sometimes, when trust allowed, soldiers shared the names inked into their own skin. Each story added to the unspoken bond between them. The colonel had given them a language of respect, and slowly they were learning to speak it. For Sarah, the greatest change came from within. She no longer hid her tattoo. Where once she rolled down her sleeves to avoid attention, now she rolled them up with quiet confidence. Not to flaunt the mark, but to own it. To show that her brother's name was not a source of shame, but of pride. And in time, others began to do the same. Soldiers who had once concealed their tattoos now revealed them openly, not as decoration, but as remembrance. The ink on their skin became stories waiting to be told, and Sarah often found herself listening, nodding, understanding in ways words could not fully express. The colonel himself never spoke of that night again. He didn't need to. His lesson had already been carved into the memory of everyone present. But his presence was felt differently afterward. When he walked into a room, soldiers straightened not just from respect for his rank, but from reverence for the man himself, the man who had bared his arms, his stories, his pain, and in doing so, reminded them all of what it meant to serve. Months later, Sarah found herself standing at attention during a ceremony, the sun blazing overhead, her sleeves rolled up. A general delivered the usual speech about honor and sacrifice. But Sarah's mind wandered back to that night in the mess hall. She realized then that what the colonel had given them was not just a moment of silence, but a legacy. A legacy of remembrance. A legacy of respect. A legacy that transformed a hall of laughter into a brotherhood bound by something deeper than jokes or bravado. Years would pass, and soldiers would come and go, but the story of that night endured. New recruits heard it within weeks of arriving, the colonel who silenced the hall with his tattoos. For some, it was just a story. But for those who had been there, Sarah most of all, it was more than that. It was a reminder that respect is the foundation of service, that every mark has meaning, and that silence can speak louder than words. Sarah carried that lesson into everything she did. When new recruits mocked someone, she remembered the colonel's silence, and she spoke with the same calm weight he had shown her. When she saw a soldier with a tattoo, She asked the story instead of judging. When she felt the weight of her brother's memory pressing heavy on her chest, she looked at her arm and felt not alone, but connected to the colonel, to her unit, to all the soldiers who carried their stories in ink and scars. One evening, long after the incident, Sarah found herself sitting alone outside the barracks. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, the air heavy with the quiet hum of insects. She traced the lines of her tattoo with her fingertips, thinking of her brother. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel grief alone. She felt pride. She felt strength. She felt the echo of the colonel's voice reminding her that every mark, every story, deserved respect. She smiled softly, knowing that his lesson had not just changed a night, it had changed her life. And as long as she carried that feather on her arm, as long as his tattoos lived in her memory, the legacy of that night would never fade. The laughter had been silenced. The respect would endure. And the story, the real story, would be told for years to come.